$9 an acre. The government man said it loud enough to carry to the back of the packed Stony Fork schoolhouse in Marlow County. His name was Howard Ellison. He was a land appraisal officer for the Army Corps of Engineers, and he had already bought the deeds to nearly every farm in that valley. "Water doesn't respect elevation, Mr. Caudill," he said, smiling. "Your field is going under the lake. It's nothing but swampland. $9 an acre is more than a fair offer, and for a man your age, turning it down would be a pride that costs you dearly." Off in a corner of the room, someone gave a quiet laugh. A few others dropped their eyes to the floor. 66-year-old Earl Caudill neither stood up nor raised his voice. He only turned his hat on his knee and spoke calmly. "You're right that water doesn't respect elevation, Mr. Ellison. It doesn't argue either. It only finds its own level." No one in that room understood what he meant. Yet 4 months later, that same Howard Ellison would not be able to look Earl in the eye in the federal courthouse in Lexington, because an old farmer had set his dead father's brass-clad level out in his own field and proved the map of the United States was wrong by exactly 19 feet. The story began in the spring of 1969 in eastern Kentucky, in a valley spread along both banks of a narrow creek called Stony Fork. That spring, vehicles with government plates rolled into the valley, survey stakes with red-painted tips began going into the ground, and men with badges on their collars started moving from farm to farm. The Army Corps of Engineers was going to build a dam across Stony Fork for flood control and a lake. Everything that backed up behind the water, houses, barns, old fences, headstones, would lie underwater forever. Earl Caudill's land sat right where the creek spilled out onto the flat. His grandfather, Ransom Caudill, had cleared that rich bottomland out of the forest with an axe in 1884. Ever since, there had always been a Caudill living on that ground, and always a Caudill buried under the same oak. Now, the government wanted to close out that 85-year bond with a stroke of a pen at $9 an acre. Earl Caudill was not a man of many words. He was 66. His hands carried the marks of 180 acres of land and 50 winters, and he had no one but his wife, Ada. He was as strong as anyone in the valley, but in this fight he was alone. Across from him stood a government, its engineers, its lawyers, and its endless papers. Most of his neighbors had already signed, taken the money, and moved to town. But Earl had something no one else in the valley had. In the back corner of his barn, wrapped in an oiled cloth, sat an old level of brass and steel that had belonged to his father, with its wooden tripod. When neighbors were laying drain tile, they would come to him. "Earl, come take a look at the grade on this line," they'd say, because he was the only man who knew how to use that instrument, how to read where water would run. No one had ever imagined that the old farmer knew by heart exactly how many feet above sea level every foot of his own land stood. But he did. Earl's closest neighbor, Cleve Bowling, had signed away the ground he'd farmed for 40 years that March and moved to town. "Earl," he'd said before he left, standing by his truck, "you can't fight the government, and you can't fight water. Take the money and find yourself a corner somewhere too." Earl had neither agreed nor argued. He'd only tipped his hat and watched Cleve disappear into the dust. Half the valley had emptied out in a single season. The figure written in Ellison's ledger for the Caudill farm was the same as everyone else's, 180 acres, subject to continual flooding, marginal floodland $9 an acre. For the government, it was an easy, closed file. Howard Ellison came to the Caudill farm himself one April afternoon. Ada poured him coffee. Earl sat at the head of the kitchen table. Ellison was not a rude man. He had been doing this work for 30 years and had talked more than 100 farmers around at a table just like this one, and he knew his business. He took a map out of his case and quietly pointed his pen at the grey area. "That's all of it, Mr. Caudill," he said. "Your house included. All of it goes under the dam. The government is paying a fair price. Most of your neighbors have accepted." Then he lowered his voice, trying to seem friendly, and added, "It's not sensible for a man your age to take on court costs." The kitchen went quiet. Ada set down the cloth in her hand and looked at her husband. Earl looked at the map for a while, then only said, "Let me think it over, Mr. Ellison," and said nothing more. After Ellison left, Earl sat over that map for a long time. His mind went back 40 years, to 1937. That year, when he was a young man, he and his father, Talmadge, had laid drain tile under the bottomland. The grade of every pipe had to be set inch by inch, and you couldn't do that by eye. Talmadge had taught him how to set up that brass instrument, how to sight through its scope, how to read the leveling rod. "Listen, son," his father had said, holding the rod at the far end of the field. "A man can lie to you, and a piece of paper can lie to you. But water doesn't lie. Water doesn't argue. It only finds its own level. If you want to know your land, you measure it yourself. You don't trust another man's map." That summer, father and son had measured every foot of the Stony Fork bottomland and written it in a notebook. Earl never forgot those elevations from the lowest corner to the highest. This was what stopped Earl at the very place where everyone else in the valley had signed. Something on that map was not right, and deep down, he knew it. Stony Fork flooded every few springs, and over 80 years of those floods, Earl had seen exactly how far the water came up. The bottomland would go under. That was the nature of the creek. But the upper field where the house stood and the high flat where the apple orchard grew had not seen water in a single spring since 1884. His grandfather had not built the house there by chance. He'd built it knowing the water could never reach it. So how could that high ground be floodland? Earl had his answer, but he was missing one thing. He did not know exactly how many feet the dam would raise the water. Without that number, the certainty inside him was worth nothing on paper. The next week, Earl got into his old truck and drove to the Marlow County Courthouse. The dam was a government project, and the plans for government projects were open to the public. He told the young clerk at the counter that he wanted to see the design drawings for the Stony Fork Dam project. The clerk gave him a puzzled look at first. It was engineers with badges who asked for those drawings, not an old farmer with mud on his boots. But Earl was polite and persistent, and the clerk finally brought a tube full of blueprints out of a back room. Earl spread the drawings across the table and went over them line by line, patiently. The drawings were complicated, but he knew what he was looking for. The highest point the water would reach. And at last he found it. The figure printed off to one side in small type. Maximum flood control pool, 612 feet above sea level. Earl wrote the number in the small notebook in his pocket. 612 feet. When Earl looked at that number, the figures he had measured himself 40 years earlier fell into place in his mind. The bottomland was below that level. The water would reach it. But he had measured the upper field, the house, and the apple orchard with his own hands too. That high flat stood far, far above 612. And yet, the government's map had shaded all 180 acres the same grey, calling it floodland, as if the spot where the house stood were as low as the creek bottom. Sitting in an office, Ellison had drawn a single line, called high ground that had stayed dry for 80 years a swamp, and tried to close out the whole of it at $9 an acre. The difference settled into the pit of Earl's stomach. But knowing it was one thing, proving it to the United States of America was another thing entirely. The next morning, before it was even fully light, he opened the oiled cloth in the corner of the barn and lifted out his father's brass level. Earl carried his father's level out to the Stony Fork Bridge and braced the legs of the tripod against the concrete. Years before, the government's own men had set a brass benchmark plate into the side of the pier. On it, in raised letters, was the elevation of that spot above sea level, 648.2 feet. Earl set the instrument over that plate, brought the bubble of the level dead center, and looked through the scope. Ada carried the rod, first on the benchmark, then at Earl's hand signals, step by step out across the field. At each station, Earl read the figure, did the subtraction, and wrote it in his small notebook, just as his father had 40 years before. Station by station the number fell. 640, 637, and at last it stopped at the top of the apple orchard, 631 feet. Earl took out of his pocket the yellowed notebook he and his father had kept in 1937, looked at the figure on the old page, then at the new one. They were the same. A lake that would rise to 612 feet at the very most would crest a full 19 feet below where his house stood. With that notebook, Earl went to the project's county office, straight to Howard Ellison. He laid the notebook on the desk and calmly explained the survey he'd done. Ellison picked the notebook up, leafed through the pages, then set it back down gently. "Mr. Caudill," he said, that measured friendliness still in his voice, "handwritten figures in a farmer's notebook don't change the official engineering map of the United States. I tell you this in good faith. If you go down this road, the only thing you'll be left with is lawyers' fees. Think of your age. Take the money." Earl took his notebook, put on his hat, and walked out without a word. But as he went through the door, his father's words were in his mind. Water doesn't argue, it only waits. What Ellison did not know was that Earl intended to do exactly that. The next week, Earl knocked on the door of an old lawyer named Frank Doyle. For years, Doyle had handled deed and land cases in that area, a man who spoke little but spoke solid. Earl spread the notebook and the blueprints across the desk and told him everything. After staring at the figures for a long while, Doyle looked up. "Earl," he said, "the government can take your land, that's their right, but they have to pay you a fair price for it in return. The law calls it fair market value, what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller for the land's best use. And no buyer in his right mind pays swamp prices for high ground that stayed dry for 80 years. Doyle took the case on contingency for a share of whatever increase they won, because Earl didn't have the money in his pocket to fight the United States for years. The case moved to the federal court in Lexington. On one side stood the government, its lawyers, its engineers, its official maps. On the other side, a 66-year-old farmer, a county lawyer, and a small notebook with figures written in it by hand. In court, the government's lawyers were clear from the start. The appraisal had been done by the Army Corps of Engineers experts according to official contour maps, and a farmer's measurement of his own field did not count as evidence against it. Howard Ellison took the stand and described his 30 years of experience. He had appraised hundreds of farms and had never met an objection like this on any of them. But when Frank Doyle rose, he asked for only one thing: an independent survey. "Your Honor," he said, "my client says the government's map is wrong, and the government says it's right. Let us measure both on the same ground from the same benchmark. The water will tell us who is right." The court granted the request and appointed a neutral surveyor. A date was set for the survey, and until that date, everyone was certain his own map was the right one. On the morning of the survey, the neutral surveyor set his instrument in the exact spot where Earl had stood, over that same brass benchmark on the bridge. The government's engineers stood on one side, Earl and Doyle on the other, watching. The surveyor started from the benchmark and measured out across the field, just as Earl had. And the numbers his instrument set down in its book matched Earl's own, foot for foot. The top of the apple orchard was 631 feet. The highest level of the lake, 612. The 19 feet between them were right there, in front of everyone's eyes. When the real issue came out, even the government's own engineer went quiet. The acquisition line for the Caudill farm had never been measured in the field. While the whole valley was being bought out at once, someone had drawn a single line with a ruler across a contour map in an office and assumed that line was right for the Caudill land too. By the time they were back in the courtroom, the air had changed. The surveyor's report was read, and the numbers were beyond dispute. The government's lawyers were no longer defending the map. They were only looking for a way out. And, in that moment, Howard Ellison, sitting a few steps from the stand, could not lift his eyes to look at Earl Caudill. For 30 years he had sat on the powerful side of the table in hundreds of farmers' kitchens and said, "Take the money." Now he carried the weight of a single line that had been proven wrong. Earl looked at him but said nothing. He neither smiled like a man who had won, nor spoke a word. His father had told him years before, holding the rod, "Water doesn't argue, it only finds its own level." That day, in that courtroom, the water had found its level. You might have thought it was over, but the government wasn't finished yet. Its lawyers tried one last move. Since the land wasn't going under, let it at least be taken as a flowage easement. Let the government buy the right to flood it if it ever needed to. But Frank Doyle showed the same figures again. Even the limit of that easement was 618 feet, and Earl's field stood above that too. The court denied the request. In the end, the ruling was plain. The upper 40 acres, the ground where the house and the apple orchard stood, were taken out of the acquisition entirely, and Earl kept that land. For the 140 acres of bottom land that would go under, the court set the value not at $9 an acre, but at the true fair market value, $300 an acre. $42,000 in all. The figure the government had first offered for the whole farm was $1,620. That small notebook Earl Caudill had filled with his own hands had made them pay the true price of his 80-year-old land. The dam filled in 1972. The bottom land of Stony Fork, the rich flat the Caudills had worked for 88 years, slipped slowly under the water. But the high field where the house stood stayed dry, and as the lake rose, that field turned into something else entirely, lakeshore. A few years later, a developer from the city knocked on Earl's door. He wanted to buy those 40 acres to turn into lakefront lots, and he offered $900 an acre. $36,000 for land the government had once valued at $360. Earl listened to the offer, finished his coffee and said, "This place isn't for sale," because that land had never been about money. As for Howard Ellison, his other appraisals in that valley were reviewed as well, and from that day on the Army Corps of Engineers would not approve an acquisition line without verifying it in the field. Ellison was not a bad man. He had only once assumed where he should have measured, and that assumption had caught up with him years later. Today, after all these years, an apple orchard still stands on the shore of that lake, and in the barn behind it, wrapped in an oiled cloth, there is an old level of brass and steel. Maybe there's been something in your own life that everyone told you to let go of, take the money, a piece of land, an old tool, or just something you alone believed was true. Earl Caudill's story reminds us that the quietest man at the table sometimes knows more than the most powerful one, as long as he's measured the truth with his own hands. So what about you? Have you ever held on to something no one else valued simply because you alone knew it was right? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to hear it. And if the stories of the underestimated, the patient, and those who in the end find their own level means something to you, you can subscribe to the channel. There are many more quiet heroes here to tell.